Okay, thanks a lot for coming, and also thanks Alejandro for inviting me to visit here. And as he said, I am most of the time working in the last years working in these algorithms and things. And also I kept some of my old theoretical physicist background. So I also try to work in the theoretical side. And this is going to be a talk about things that we did in the last 5 years, more or less, by looking at the, at the questions that describe perturbed black holes. And one of the things, well, actually, the project started as many projects in a completely different way, and we ended up here. It's difficult even for me now to remember why we ended up here. But one of the things we found is that there is a connection, deep connection between the dynamics of black holes and the dynamics of solitons, and through some hidden symmetry. So I want to try to talk about this, and also it has some implications for quasi-normal modes, and in particular also for gravitational waves observations as well. As you will see, there is some characteristics that are very. So please interrupt me anytime if you don't understand something, or I will. Although there are questions, I will try to be more qualitative. Okay, so let's see. So it was working before. Now it's not working. Okay, maybe now it's working. Okay, so this is the idea. I'm going to start with some motivation about black holes and phenomena of black holes that can be described by this perturbation theory. I will tell you some basics of perturbation theory. Mainly, we are going to work on non-rotating black holes. So we found many results there. So we are not yet jumping into the rotating black holes, which are also very interesting, right? And most black holes should be rotating. And then I will tell you what hidden symmetries we found inside there and what they mean, right? So this is connected with the famous Cortez-Brito equation, which is an equation I myself didn't. Every time when I saw the first time, I thought I will never in my life work with this equation. And then you say, and then I will tell you what are the implications for this. For one topic that is now very interesting is that many people are finding that if you perturb a little bit the potential of the black hole, the quasi-normal modes may get completely different values. So some people is getting worried about what are the implications of this for gravitational waves, right? Because in gravitational waves, we are trying to measure these modes, what it means to measure them, right? Okay, so let's go. So first of all, a bit of motivation. One thing I always like to show you is the spectrum of black holes. So the thing is just to remark that black holes are objects that can have any size, right? So I will tell you now what we know about the size of black holes. So first of all, okay, you can go in the low size up to the Planck mass size. This is an uncharted territory where now is very fashionable the question of primordial black hole. Primordial black holes that could have formed at the beginning of the universe in the inflationary stage, and that can have an impact now in many, for example, from the CMB polarization to lensing, also in gravitational waves. They may also induce backgrounds of gravitational waves. And this is, so basically until solar masses, we know almost anything about black holes, right? So actually, now we are questioning ourselves whether there is a gap between the masses of neutron stars, which probably the most massive are around 2 solar masses, to the masses that we are starting seeing black holes, which are like around 5 solar masses. Now with LIGO, I think there are some recent detections that are falling into this mass gap, and it's not clear what is known with this. So this is something also very interesting. Then here we know, we think we know, this is stellar mass black holes. We think we know through the study of the lives of stars, how they collapse. And now we have so many methods to look at them, from X-rays to ground-based detectors, and then the Vulcan diffusion detectors. And this goes up to this order amount, almost around 100 solar masses, where there is also another gap. And this is what is called the pair instability supernova. So what happens is that when you have very massive stars that come from these black holes, because from a black hole of maybe 100 solar masses, you need a star that accumulates 200 solar masses. So when they are too big, at some point when they are trying to collapse, they can form pair positron electrons in a way that this can trigger, I don't know anything about this mechanism, but I know what people tells me, that can trigger thermonuclear reactions, and then part of the mass can be ejected, so the formation of black hole is frustrated. So there is no black hole formation. So, but we have seen with LIGO and Virgo black holes there. So it may be that this mechanism is not what people think, although astrophysicists are very confident on this, or that some of these black holes are secondary black holes, that they form because two black holes already collide and form a bigger one. So this is something to clarify. Then we have intermediate mass black holes. Then we are seeing now black holes that are below 100 solar masses, which is the low end. And in those galaxies, we are start seeing black holes of 10 to the 5. So from the ends, we are starting seeing these black holes. But in the middle, we know almost nothing because people believe that these black holes may be forming globular clusters where it is very difficult to observe. And maybe here gravitational waves can tell us something in the near future. And then we know that we have another class of black holes. I mean, the reason why separate intermediate from stellar is mostly because the formation mechanism should be different. These intermediate mass black holes, if they are forming globular clusters, have a different mechanism than the stellar black holes. And the supermassive black holes as well, they have a different mechanism because they are supposed to be formed in cosmological times at the universe. And here there is also a lot of discussion about what is the mechanism. I mean, some people think about this first population of stars, what is called the population 3 stars. Other people think about runaways of many different star systems, or even collapse of big quantities of gas because there is low metallicity and it's easier to produce this. But this is something that up to 10 to 10 solar masses, we don't know. And actually, this is the limit from the more massive black holes that we know. When actually there is people that are recording the record. Now we have a record from James Webb telescope or whatever. So it's around 10 to the 10. I mean, maybe a factor 2, a factor 3, but this is the limit of black holes that we know. Okay, and then from there on, we don't know nothing. And then we have a black hole in our own galaxy that we know that is 4.3 million solar masses. This will be interesting for LISA. For instance, this is the prototypical black hole that we like for LISA. But these black holes, typically, for instance, the Milky Way galaxy, what happens with it is that it's very quiet. So then there is no activity. And then if you think about galaxies far away from us, they're very difficult to see if they don't have activity, right? Electromagnetic activity or things like this. So that's why we don't know too many of these. And okay, and both the cosmic modes, the frequencies of the cosmic modes and the curvature, increases as this is obvious as we go down in size. Okay. So the situation in general relativity is that is expressed in this conjecture, which is called the cosmic tension-ship, that says that when you have gravitational collapse and a symmetry is formed, it has always to be covered by a horizon. So it's always not observable by observers, right? Physical observers. And then there is the other end is that if you use this conjecture, you get to another conjecture, which is the Noether conjecture that tells us that that if the cosmic tension-ship is correct, then the final state has to be a stationary black hole within general relativity. We assume general relativity is correct. And then general relativity tells us that there is only one family of vacuum and stationary solutions, which is the Kerr family of black holes. And this is expressed very well by this observation of Chandrasekhar in his book that says that the black holes of nature are the most perfect microscopic objects that are in the universe. The only elements in their construction are our concepts of space and time. And since general relativity provides only one unique family of solutions for the description, they are the simplest objects as well. And actually, indeed, I mean, you see, you have an object that can have any size from microscopic to huge, even astrophysical sizes. That is described by a single model, and it's a model that has only 2 parameters. Well, in astrophysics, in the astrophysical context, in general, it can have 3, no? Mass, intrinsic angular momentum, spin, and electric charge. These are the only things. So 3 numbers that can describe objects that go through a line. So this is, I think that always, I think many people is, surprised by this fact, in particular Chandrasekhar. Okay. So let me tell you now to understand, I mean, from qualitative things is how we got to the Kerr solution. There are 2 paths, and this is something I was working in the old times in more general relativity. So, okay, a black hole is a solution of Einstein vacuum equations, and there is a way to try to find the solution by using symmetries. You can say, okay, if I have a black hole, it has to be stationary and axisymmetry, right? Because it's rotating, it's like a bottle. You turn it around, it has to have this symmetry. And then, okay, you tend to impose this. So mathematically, it means that you have a group of symmetries that is abelian. It's very simple. So 2 commuting vectors. And it turns out that if you can form 2 quantities, you take the symmetry, the Killing vector that gives you the stationarity, you can form the norm and the twist. And then you can form a potential that is called dense potential, which is basically the real part is the norm of this vector field, and the other part is the rotation. So basically, is the derivative of the rotation is what gives you this vector. So omega, small omega, is like a vector or one form, and big omega is just a scalar. Is the differential rotation. So these are functions. These are functions of the radius and the polar angle. So it turns out that this potential for any vacuum stationary solution of Einstein equation satisfies this equation. It's called Ernst equation. And you look at it and you say, wow, this is a horrible equation, right? So, okay. What it has special? So it turns out that this equation is one of the few equations in mathematics that is completely integrable. Okay? And people found later that it's equivalent, for instance, to other equations in other areas of physics, like the isotropic Heisenberg model or even the Yang-Self-Dual gauge field. So this is a kind of a reduction of Yang-Mills equation. Okay? And therefore, it can be solved by, since this is completely integral, you can solve it by something that is called the inverse scattering method, who was already proposed by Kruskal, well, Miura, Gardner, and Kruskal at the end of the 60s. And for instance, here you see this book, Gravitational Solitons. It's a book where Vladimir Belinsky and Eric Verdaguet, they summarize all the solutions of Einstein equation found by this method, analytically, just because this equation is completely integrable. So, okay, so here you have already a first surprise, something that is very difficult that happens that you have this kind of equation, right? So general relativity already is giving you one. Then the other way of looking at the Kerr solution is completely different from this. Instead of doing symmetry reduction, you say, okay, I'm going to do a geometric reduction. I'm going to think, instead of thinking in terms of symmetries, I'm going to think in terms of geometry. And then, okay, now what I'm going to say, it's going, maybe for so many of you, doesn't going to mean anything, but let me explain. So one of the things that people try to, in order to characterize space-time, one of the things people look is at the curvature. But the curvature, you have two parts. One part that is given by the Ricci tensor, but the Ricci tensor is given by matter through Einstein equations. So this is already determined locally. So there's another part of the curvature, which is the Weyl tensor, which is not determined locally by the... And then people say, okay, we can classify this tensor and algebraically. It's like when you have a matrix and you say, I can classify the types of matrices, you know, the ones that are diagonal, the ones that are triangular. You know, there is a algebraic classification that is in the books of linear algebra. This is very similar. Actually, you can do the same trick. It's the same mathematics. And then there is one type, that this type D, Petrov was the guy that did this classification. The type D is like correspond to Colombian fields. You know, fields like a mass, like Schwarzschild or Kerr. Okay? So people knew Schwarzschild was type D, and also people using the geodesic deviation equation realized that it has to be a kind of Colombian field. So, okay, maybe we can, if we are looking for a rotating solution, let's impose that this is Petrov D, and let's see what it brings us. So, well, there is a formalism where you can use these null directions, but basically what people realize is that then when you have this type D, and in vacuum, it implies that there are two null directions, so like, so direction that follows like, that are like eigenvalues, eigenvectors of this tensor. And they are also geodesic and shear field, so that they don't distort. The evolution doesn't get distorted. So you have a beam of these light rays. The beam is not distorted. It can expand or contract, but cannot be, you know, distorted. And this is actually how Kerr found the solution first. Actually, Kerr knew about this. He was actually in Texas. Texas at that time was a center of general relativity with many famous people. Actually, other people tried and they failed because they made a mistake in solving the equations. And he fixed the mistake and he found for the first time this equation. Well, this is the solution, Killen fields. And actually, what we know, this is another example where we have these hidden symmetries. You only have these two symmetries, the stationarity and axis symmetry. You will not be able to separate the geodesic equations and solve it so easily as we solve now. Or you could not separate the equation for test fields, like, for instance, electromagnetic field, scalar fields on Kerr, and also the gravitational perturbations, the famous Minkowski equation. You could not separate this equation, and we could not. So what is behind this separability, which is what people found, people first realized about the separability, and then they realized that there was a symmetry, which is a bit more complicated. Instead of being a Killing vector, it's a Killing tensor. And this is typically called a hidden symmetry because something that doesn't appear clearly in a first sight, right? Actually, one of the things I did in the past with a colleague of mine is to look at, is there a connection between these two approaches, the geometric approach and the symmetry approach? And then indeed we found one. So there is, Papetrou was an older activist. He realized something very simple, and is you take a Killing vector and you form what it will be like, electromagnetic tensor, because the Killing vector field equations, this is twice this, right? So this satisfies Maxwell equations automatically for any Killing. So you can build a solution of Maxwell equations if you have a Killing. And you see that the Maxwell equations have a current here. And this current, when you are in vacuum, the Ricci tensor is zero. So you have a solution of the vacuum Maxwell equations in vacuum. And actually, automatically comes in this Lorentz gauge because of the Killing equations, this is the divergence free. So what we realize is that in 4 dimensions, if we use this Papetrou field, you can determine completely the Weyl tensor in terms of the symmetries. Actually, you see the 3 terms in the end are the Nishimoto tensor. So when you are in vacuum, only the first term realizes. So basically, you can determine the Weyl tensor, which is the geometrical part, from something that comes from the symmetries. But this is only in 4 dimensions. When you're not in 4 dimensions, this is something very incredible. This inversion cannot be done. So yeah, things that are okay. And funny enough, when you take the Killing to be the Killing to be the time-like Killing, it turns out that this electromagnetic field is the electromagnetic field that you have in Kerr-Newman. The solution of Kerr-Newman comes when you solve it with the electromagnetic Maxwell equations. It comes with an electromagnetic field. So it's this electromagnetic field. No? Wonderful things of general relativity. Anyway, so what we were motivated as is in perturbation theories for describing a certain type of physical processes. First, for instance, we have scattering processes. There are 2 types. One, when you have things that come from infinity to the black hole. Like, for instance, you throw to the black hole matter, or you throw to the black hole electromagnetic waves. Like, for instance, there is this Blandford-Schneider process, and you can extract the energy. And the other one is the converse. So you have something that goes from the horizon to the stereo. And you will say, what is this? For instance, this is the case of the Hawking radiation, right? So you have some quanta that creates radiation, and this radiation has to go through the barrier of the potential. So some of these radiation, actually, this is something that is very important. When you compute Hawking radiation, you should not be left with the thing you compute at the radiation. You have to apply the Green body factors because there is a potential barrier. Actually, this is the potential barrier. So actually, typically when we think about black holes, we think about the horizon. But there is something that is, and the people that here is working in Cosmos must know very well, is that there is something that characterizes also the black hole, which is the apotential. And it's basically a potential barrier. So here the horizon is on the left. Actually, in this is the tortoise coordinate, so it's very far away. And infinity is going into the other direction. And then you have basically it's a barrier, right? So when you have radiation that goes from one side to the other, you are going to have always reflected and transmitted radiation. And the quasi-normal modes, in particular, these are modes that when you impose that radiation only goes either to the horizon, but nothing coming from the horizon, or goes to infinity, nothing coming from infinity. When you put these boundary conditions, you have that the black holes are freely oscillating with some complex frequencies. And then what happens is that the real part of this complex frequency is the oscillation frequency, the typical of a wave, and the imaginary part gives you the damping time. So actually, this is not a proper eigenvalue problem, because this is not like in quantum mechanics that you have a self-adjoint operator. When you put these boundary conditions, you stop being self-adjoint, and this is why you have complex frequencies. This is, for instance, there is an analog of this in optical cavities. When you have a typical cavity, you have typically an oscillator, right, and it goes like black and white. But you can have always some leakage. When you have leakage, then the radiation can reach infinity, and then the problem in the cavity stops to be self-adjoint and it becomes not self-adjoint, and then you have also complex frequencies because you have a damping of the radiation that is inside, right? here is the same. In reality, in a black hole, what is oscillating with the cosmic most is the whole space outside the black hole, right? So it's infinity, and this is also one of the reasons why this happens. Okay. So yeah, now cosmic modes are playing a very important role. For instance, when you perturb the black hole and you let it oscillate, they are dominated by quasi-normal modes. For instance, in the case of magnetic black holes, this is why it's important for gravitational waves. They describe when the two black holes collide and form a single black hole. This black hole initially is the form. It's like a peanut shape, and then this peanut shape evolves towards a single black hole by emitting these quasi-normal modes. Okay, so they describe this phase. Actually, in head-on collisions, what people found is that basically most of the gravitational wave signal is dominated by the ring down, dominated by these quasi-normal modes. So in the case of, which is not astrophysical, right? Astrophysically, typically, is you have something that is in an orbit, and then the orbit is rings until it collides. So therefore, and this is why it's very important to analyze them, is it has become now a kind of a programming, especially for not only for the quantum, but especially for the future ones, which will have an enhanced sensitivity, and we'll be able to detect this with much more precision. Especially like on the ground, we have these projects. In Europe, we have this Einstein telescope. Here in the US, you have the Cosmic Explorer, and there is LISA, which is a joint now project. And the idea is to see multiple quasi-normal modes, right? And then you can do tests like fundamental physics, because as we said at the beginning, if a black hole is characterized by two numbers, mass and spin, and you have these free oscillations, which are characterized by the potential, which is also characterized by these two numbers, these quasi-normal modes have to be determined by these two numbers. So once you have two frequencies, the third frequency is already a test, because it has to follow when general relativity tells you. So this is a very important program now in gravitational waves, and this is very important that we enhance. Okay, so let me tell you what are the basics of black hole perturbation theory. Well, one of the applications is also for binary systems that are in the stream mass ratio. So then you can see that the system is the big black hole plus perturbation from the small one. So this is also a huge area of research in what is called the self-force approach. One thing that is important to notice is that when we talk about gauges in black hole perturbation theory, some people talk about connector formation, but what is happening is that you are comparing to space-time. You are comparing the background space-time and the perturbed space-time. And there are different infinite ways of comparing them, because you need to identify points in the two space-times. And therefore, each of these identifications is a gauge. And so this is where it comes from. So let's see in the case of Schwarzschild. So the Schwarzschild has this very simple structure, which is you can see it's like a 2x2 structure. Here you have the sphere, and you have here a Lorentzian manifold that is two-dimensional. Right? Well, actually, in the case of Schwarzschild, is this F, where F is 1 minus 2m divided by R. Right? So then the fact that you have this spherical symmetry, it allows you to decompose the perturbations in spherical harmonics, scalar vector and tensor spherical harmonics. Yes, and naturally the gauge transformation, as usual, we can put back in a form of a coordinate form, but you have to keep in mind that the geometrical meaning that it has, right? So each of these gauge transformations induces a change in the metric, and this is what sometimes confuses people, because you're working one gauge and you start starting physical consequences. You have to be careful, right? So, okay, you have this decomposition, and then actually you can see that there are two types of harmonics. One that have all parity, how they transform and the reflections, and ones that have even parity, and they are not very symmetric, because in the even parity we have scalar harmonics, we have vector harmonics in the two of them, and also we have tensor harmonics in the two of them. But in the polar case, we have two types of tensor harmonics, while in the odd parity we only have one. So basically what happens is that there are only 3 components for the axial or odd parity, and 7 for the polar or even parity. So this is a bit not symmetric, right? So that is how it is. So the perturbative equations, you can decompose the components of the Einstein equations like this. And basically what happens is that you can decouple all the equations for harmonic and also by parity. So you have, and now you pass from a 3+1 problem to an infinite problems in 2 dimensions in this Lorentzian manifold, right? So you have 3 equations for the for the odd parity or axial, and you have 7 equations for the even parity or axial. And basically, you can see like this, like few theories in this M2. So you are simplifying a lot your problem. So, and also you can do the same with the gauge. You can also decompose the gauge in spherical harmonics, and you have 3 components for the even parity and only 1 for the odd parity. From the 4, 3 go to the even parity, 1 goes to the odd parity. And you can form gauge invariant quantities. I'm not going to enter into this. So the only thing again is that you realize that you have, because we have 4 gauges, so there must be 6. At most, you can have 6 quantities that are independent, that are gauge invariant, and you have 4 in the even parity sector and 2 in the odd parity. Okay, then and then you just write the Einstein equations. You can write it like this, and when you put this Lorentz gauge, you have like a wave operator and the curvature that mixes the. So it's a kind of a wave equation, basically. So the first breakthrough came in the 1957, where Tullio Ricci and John Wheeler looked at this problem. They were trying to see whether the singularity was stable or not. So okay, let's perturb it and let's see what happens, right? They immediately realized that it was a tough problem. I mean, because you do it in paper and pencil, right? The equations are horrible. So, okay, let's look at the axial sector that are only 3 equations, right? Okay. So they managed to, then it's a couple system. It's a linear system, right? Because you are perturbing, but still they are coupled. And so what they found is a way of decoupling the equations in terms of a wave equation. Actually, when you write it, so you see, and this is with a potential, and the potential is this, is the famous Ricci-Weyl potential, and this is the wave function depends on the metric perturbation. And actually, this is the gauge invariant form. Well, and it is in gauge invariant because this wave function contains all the physics of the perturbations. You can compute the radiation, of energy, angular momentum, everything physical can be computed in terms of this wave function. This is very nice. So because you don't need to go back and reconstruct the metric for doing the physics. So once you have your master equation, you can do all the physics only with this master equation. This is what is nice about this thing. Actually, in Kerr, it's the same with Tarkovsky. The Tarkovsky solution gives you all the physics, basically. Okay? And then we have to wait until 1974 until somebody found how to decouple this equation. It was Celili. Actually, I don't have a picture of him because I think he left physics after this. I think he went to the Navy, to the Air Force. I don't know where he went, but this is actually when you have now to decouple 7 equations. So for here, you see the potential looks much horrible, right? Well, you see you don't have this lambda is this function. So yeah, it looks much complicated. And also the wave function too, it looks much more complicated, right? But he managed combining equation, multiply this equation by this, take the derivative of this one, add it to this one. So, but crazy stuff, right? I mean, but he found it. Okay, so then we have the situation is that we have these master equations. We have 2 different wave functions for the axial sector, which is the Ricci-Weyl, and there was this one found by Cunningham, Price, and Moncrief, and we have the one of Celili, and Moncrief wrote it in this gauge invariant form. Okay. Anyway. So the question, then one of the things I remember we were working in the original, I was working with a colleague of mine. We were working on something very different, but we needed to also find perturbations. It was for a gravastar. You know what it is, a gravastar. It's a very weird object. And I didn't like it to work on this, but I have a colleague of mine that has problems, so I tried to help him. And then we didn't know how to decouple the questions in general. So what we did, I mean, it has to be a systematic way of doing this instead of, artistic or inspiring way, right? So we asked the following question. So we work in a completed general gauge. We can do it now because we have computers. Ricci and Wheeler didn't have computers, so they didn't have computers, so they tried to work in a simplified gauge, the Ricci-Weyl gauge. But we work in a general gauge. We just burn a bit the computer, and that's it. So we assume that the master function has to be a linear combination of metric perturbations and their first derivatives. A very general combination. So I'm not going to write it here. It's long. And the coefficients are going only to depend on the radial area coordinate because it depends only on the background, and the background is stationary, so it can only depend on that. So we did that. And what we are going to do is, the only thing we are going to do is to impose that these wave functions, that these combinations satisfy a wave equation of this type. And we don't even fix the potential. We just let Einstein equations to tell us what is the potential. So we put this into the Einstein equations, then it explodes, and then you start finding the coefficients. And then in the end, we found the most general solution. And we found that there are two branches of solutions. There is one branch where you have the typical solutions. It's a general combination of the Ricci-Weyl and the Cunningham-Paris-Moncrief. And another one where you have the Cerini-Moncrief and another one, which we thought that it was new, but you will see it was not so new as we thought. And is written in this way. Anyway, this is not important how it is. But then we realized that people using the closed limit approximation, the second order of perturbations, they use it, but they didn't mention that it was for them. I think they didn't know it was new for them. But it's the only place where we saw these other master equations. And then here the potential are the typical potential, the ones that we already know, the Ricci-Weyl and the Cerini. And the relation is that one of them is of the wave function is the time derivative of the other. So they are even simply related. Then we found another branch. This is what I'm going to tell you, what we call it the Darboux branch, where we have very different wave functions. So you see, they are built from the old ones. You see, but not the two of them. For example, here is the Cunningham-Paris-Moncrief, and here is the Cerini-Moncrief. And here, these coefficients are a very complicated function. It's only a function of R, but it's a very complicated function of the potential, which is not given. Okay? And these are all other metric perturbations. So this is the potential. And then what we found is that the potential is anything that satisfies this horrible equation. So you have basically this delta B is the difference between the potential, the canonical, so the potential here in this branch and the potential in the old branch. But you just need to satisfy this equation. And then there are infinite potentials. So then, okay, then we have here, and this is the next part of the talk, is that we realize we have a lot of equations, master equations, and what we do with this. So what we try to so this is the summary. These are these wave equations. The standard branch, we have this combination of the typical ones for the even and odd parity. And then we have these new branches. And then what we realize is that there is something called Darboux transformations that are going to be behind this. A Darboux transformation is something that you have a wave equation with a potential. So basically, your wave equation is determined by the wave function and the potential. And you pass to another wave function with, sorry, another master equation with another wave function and another potential. So if the wave function and the potential are rated by this, what this G is what we are going to call the generating function of this transformation, we say that these equations are rated by Darboux transformations. So what kind of craziness is this, right? And then this is an equation for the generating function. It's a consistency equation. It's a quadratic equation. This is what. And then what happened is that actually in the past the Darboux transformation was introduced for time-independent wave functions. So it's like when you have, instead of having time dependent, you have a frequency. And basically we have these four branches. We have the standard branch for odd parity, the standard branch for even parity, the Darboux branch for odd parity, and the Darboux branch for even parity. And then what we found is that these two are rated by a Darboux transformation with this generating function. Basically, it's the integral of the difference between the two potentials in the two sectors. These two are also related by the difference. So all of them are related by the integration of the difference between the potentials. So basically, all the possible master equations are corrected by Darboux transformations. Actually, this transformation, it was known. Second knew the transformation. He didn't know that it was a Darboux transformation. It was then discovered by these people later, before we did our work. And we just put the other parts of the diagram. Actually, this basically is valid not only for Schwarzschild, for any spherically symmetric background. You can have a Schwarzschild de Sitter, Schwarzschild de Sitter, all the things that are spherically symmetric. So we also did an extension with matter sources, and it's not important here. So what happens if we pass now to the frequency domain picture? Imagine that you are looking now for black holes. So what you do is that you put that the time dependence of the wave function is basically a wave, right? That's a plane wave in time, right? And therefore, what you have is that the wave function, the wave equation becomes an Schrödinger equation, right? Because now, let me see, but the second derivative of time becomes omega squared, right? So you have and this is a Schrödinger equation. So something that is very interesting is that you have already a solution of your Schrödinger equation for any frequency. Doesn't depend on the frequency omega 0 doesn't have to be this omega. This logarithmic derivative of this wave function is a Darboux generating transformation. It's a Darboux, yes, generating function. So it generates a Darboux transformation. And actually, but you see, it generates a transformation between two Schrodinger equations that have the eigenvalue omega squared, not the eigenvalue omega 0. So that's very interesting, right? Because, and actually, this is what shows, in particular, if you, because we have connected even parity and odd parity, and they are connected by a Darboux transformation, it means that they must have the same spectrum, right? Because you see, the Darboux transformation doesn't change the frequency. So, and actually, this was known by Chanaseka. The only thing is Chanaseka didn't know that this was a Darboux transformation. And this is why in general relativity, we have that the spectrum of quasi-normal modes of odd parity modes and even parity are the same. Actually, this is something very delicate because at the moment you change the theory or even you change the object, if instead of putting a black hole, you put a neutron star, all these things break down. You don't have any more isospectrality. So we can, so somehow this indicator is that isospectrality can be a signature of general relativity. So this is something that we can look at if at some point we manage to get precise values of frequencies from gravitational observation. This is a question that we have to ask ourselves. Is isospectrality still holding or not? Right? So anyway,
Is this related to the spherical symmetry? Or?
Well, the spherical symmetry is what gives you this wave, these master equations, which then we are still left to do this kind of thing in Kerr. In Kerr, there is a difficulty that is in Kerr is there is no you don't decompose in spherical harmonics initially, so everything is mixed. So, but there are some works now, actually, Nico, Younes, and other people. They managed to introduce some parity operators where you can distinguish that from. I mean, you can define odd parity and even parity modes, and they find that they are isospectral. The transformation is not a Darboux transformation; it's something a bit more complicated. It also depends on the formulation, but we know. But there is something that people call transformation theory, and is this idea? Is the idea of you have a master equation and then you want to transform to another master equation. For example, one thing that people did in the past is that the Tokowski equation is quite complicated. But then if you are looking, for example, you can, and actually it's higher order because it's curvature equation. What people did is, okay, maybe I can apply to the Tokowski equation to a spherical symmetric black hole, and then I can reduce. And then you can reduce to some other equation like the Press-Bardeen, and then you can see that there are transformations jumping from already Ricci-Wheeler to this Press-Bardeen. So there are a number of transformations there, which they go beyond even this Darboux transformation, which still we don't control. But that this is fundamental now. Even last year I was in the Amaldi GR conference in Glasgow, and the first talk was about this mathematics about instability of Kerr. And this is super complicated mathematical issue. And what I was really impressed is that apart from all these Sobolev spaces they used to prove the stability, the equation that they had to do is that they were doing transformation theory to come up with a sort of nonlinear master equation where they apply all the machinery of this. So I mean, all this transformation theory, which I think is not clear yet when you go beyond spherical symmetry, is something that I think is in our plan, but okay, there are many things to do. It's something I think there is a lot of insight there that we need to understand somehow. Okay. Actually, one thing that happens is that this Darboux transformation between Ricci-Wheeler and Zerilli, the ones that gives you the isospectrality, comes out with something that is analytical. For instance, this is the wave function. This is actually, you see the frequency here is purely imaginary, right? So I think that people that are working with Greg, I think you have been looking for modes that are algebraically special and they are purely imaginary. So this mode is already one of these algebraically special modes. Is purely imaginary. This is what in the context of quantum mechanics typically called an anti-bound state, right? Because and this is the generating function. It's very simple, and you can see it works. Okay. Yeah. Okay. What else? Yeah, there is also connection because you can see that then the potentials can be written in terms of the engineering function in this simple way. So you can see, when you saw the expression of the Ritchie-Wheeler and Cerilli looked much complicated than Ritchie-Wheeler. But in the end, there is only a sign difference here between the two. So this sign difference makes the potential. But anyway, well, the message of this is that all these potentials have the same physics. In reality, you could even find you could find the equational modes of the axial modes using the polar modes or the other way around. Actually, this also has a connection with what is called SUSY quantum mechanics, where you also have a degenerate system where you have two Hamiltonians, and okay, it's also another connection that we found. Let me see. Yes, well, this is a. Okay, let me, in the few minutes I have, let me tell you a connection which is much more now with solitons, right? So all these things of Darboux, when you look at the literature in mathematical literature, we didn't know anything at that time. We realized that it has to do with, you know, higher mathematical structures that we didn't understand at the moment, but are related with the fact that I mentioned at the beginning, integrability. Integrability is something that I always, as a physicist, I always associated with a mathematical property. You were lucky, you have this property, and you can simplify your life, but it's not something that has a deep meaning. Then by looking at studying integrability, I realized it has a really, really deeper meaning.
It's associated with symmetries, right?
It's associated also you will see now. I mean, when this Cortevere brick is an equation, this is the question I promised myself I will never work on it, because I said, this is horrible, and you see I am not working on it. This is, never promise yourself anything, because it's like, and this equation, it was found by, well, Cortevere, other people look at it, but basically it's describing dynamics of water, dynamics of fluids in shallow water, okay? So actually, and solitons are a solution. This is the famous thing, you know, there is in Scotland, actually talking about Glasgow, there was a canal, it's called the Union Canal, that joins Glasgow and Edinburgh, imagine, right? So, and then there was this guy, famous guy, well, I don't remember the name, but it will come my name, that he saw this soliton. It was a shape that was moving with keeping the profile, and he was in a horse, and he followed for several miles the profile, and then actually he decided, oh, this has to be something that we don't know, and he worked mathematically in it. I don't think he got anywhere, but okay. But other people, and actually one thing that you can see in solitons is that this is a nonlinear equation. You see, it's a nonlinear equation. Actually, so it has all kinds of things that you will not want to work on this, right? Because it has third derivatives, and so first derivatives in time, but third derivatives in space, crazy already, and then nonlinear term, right? So actually what happens here is that the soliton basically is precisely the balance between nonlinearity that wants to contract the package of, let's say, the profile, and a dispersive term, because these derivative terms, high derivatives, are dispersive, which tend to disperse. So basically it's a delicate balance between dispersion and contraction, which keeps the thing equilibrated non-linearly and travels like this. So actually it's even worse, because when you have to, imagine that you have two solitons, and they are moving, this is in one direction, but then they can move, like one can pass the other. So here there is a nonlinear interaction where strange things happen, but once this package passes the other one, they have exactly the same shape as before the interaction. So it's really amazing. So this is something really very interesting. Okay, as I said, well, in the case of shallow water, it can be, as I said, you can use it by using, you just need to take into account shallow water, which means also the gravity of and surface tension. Basically, this is what it is. And this equation, then people found out, and actually this was the revival, because I think it was in the Princeton plasma group where this thing was revival. Because they were studying plasmas, and they realized that they have the Cortevere equation. They did numerical simulation, and they found all these things, and then they do it numerically at the beginning, and then when they realized how amazing it was, they said, okay, there has to be something analytical on this. This is the original one. This is basically describes you the question describes the height with respect to equilibrium. So this equilibrium will be when the water is, you know, quiet, and this equation describes this. Well, this is, as you see, H is elevation. This is a constant related with uniform motion of the fluid. G is basically, you know, Earth gravity field, and well, it's a constant. Also, this is another constant that is related to surface tension, the density, and the height and the equilibrium height. So you can do this transformation, which is not, it's basically constants, right? And go back to the previous equation we have. So one thing that is amazing here, and this is not we didn't invent this. Okay, so this was invented by these guys that I told you in Princeton in the 70s, and they found this amazing problem. But we apply it to black holes. So is that we have a linear problem. It's a Schrodinger equation that describes in particular quasi-normal modes. And what we are going to do is something that you say is going to be weird. We are going to deform this equation. Basically, deforming the equation means taking the main ingredients, the potential, the wave function, and the frequency, and add an extra dependence on a variable. Okay, this is deforming. Basically, when you can say that putting tau equals 0 gives you the initial values. Okay, and tau different from 0 deforms these functions. Okay, so basically you just have an equation where you just introduce this dependence. Nothing fancy. Now let's assume that the wave function. Well, yeah. Now we have to say how this is the form, right? For example, we can say that the deformation, so the change of the wave function in tau is this weird operator. Say, okay, why is this? This is the operator where you can have something that is called a Lax pair. A Lax pair means that your Schrodinger operator, if you force that your Schrodinger operator evolves like this as a Hamiltonian, this is a kind of a unitary evolution or Hamiltonian evolution, then this implies that the deformation, so you impose this deformation for the wave function that gives you this kind of Hamiltonian evolution, then this implies that your potential has to satisfy a KdV. And you see the initial KdV for shallow water was related to the height, which is basically the Newtonian potential. And this is related with the potential of the black hole. Okay? And then you apply this, what you found is the following consistency for this deformation. So is that you have this equation, and this equation is telling you that if the potential follows the form according to the KdV equation, then the only possibility is that the frequency is not the form. So this is so it means that it preserves the spectrum. So it's another isospectrality transformation. Okay, and in particular, this is a very complicated. There is a simple derivation, but this derivation you need to impose that the wave function is normalizable, which is good for when you are in a quantum mechanical problem where you have bound states and the states are normalizable. But the quasi-normal modes, as I said, they are not states from a self-adjoint operator, and they are not normalizable. So when you integrate the wave function of quasi-normal mode, this gives you infinity. Okay, but in this derivation, it applies to quasi-normal modes. So okay, for instance, what happens in this period is that one of the things that's why it's called Lax pair is that when you have a Lax pair, immediately you have an infinite number of first integrals. I'm going to finish soon with this. I'm not going to go further. And actually, Gardner, which was another part of the team of Martin Kruskal and other people, he showed that actually you can formulate these first integrals as some symmetries that can be formulated as a Hamiltonian symmetry. Actually, what he realized that these symmetries are KdV equations, but with higher derivatives. So you have the same time derivative, like this tau derivative of the potential, but now instead of having 3 derivatives, you can have 5 derivatives, 7 derivatives, 9 derivatives, and each of these equations is a symmetry and gives you a conserved quantity. All this looked like magic at that time, and then there were the people in the Soviet Union said, okay, no, this cannot be magic. And then what they realized is that actually you can have the KdV equations led to a complete integral Hamiltonian system that admits action and variables that basically constructed from the scattering data of the Schrodinger equation. And basically they gave an interpretation of what people were finding, like Kruskal, other people were finding. It's a different point of view. Okay, let me see. I'm going to so we can do a scattering. So this is the scattering that coming from the horizon. You have imagine that you have a quanta that goes from the horizon, goes to the potential barrier. Some part is transmitted and some part is reflected. And these are the Boliov coefficients, which gives you also the reflection and transmission coefficients. This is what people is doing. This is standard scattering theory in black holes. So when you deform this thing, you add the deformation, it turns out that the deformation according to the Cavalier flow gives you a conserved quantity. So this Bolivarov coefficient has to be conserved. And when you write the wave function in this way with this phase integral, and this gives you this expression for the Bolivarov coefficient that can be expanded in inverse potentials of the frequency. What you have is that all these coefficients here, when you integrate them over space, have to be also conserved. So these are the integrals. These are the conserved integrals that you get. And actually, these conserved integrals, what I'm going to show you here is, but you only have. I'm not going to enter into this because it's too much detail. But basically, these conserved integrals, yeah, they are all the same for all the potentials independent in the black holes. We saw that all the possible potentials are quantum by Darboux. They are the same for all the potentials. This is all I want to say you. And the other thing I want to tell you is what we can do with this. So these conserved quantities basically are integrals of polynomials of the potential and derivative of the potentials. And actually, you can even construct, as I showed you, these action variables. But the important thing is that you have these trace identities. This comes from, you take the Green function. You know, the Green function depends on two coordinates, x and x prime. If you integrate over x equal to the diagonal, so x equal to x prime, you get some identities. These are typically called trace identities. And these identities basically take the form of a moment problem. So imagine when you have a distribution function, probability distribution function. P is a probability distribution function. You multiply by the variable to a power, and this is a moment. This is the moment, the 2n moment of this distribution function. You know, like in the Gaussian, the first moment is the mean, and the second moment is the variance, right? So now what happens is that in black holes we have also this moment relations, where now the moments are basically the Cavalier integrals, and the distribution is the logarithm of the transmission coefficient. Right? Okay. So what I can do is, so this is very interesting because what I can do is that typically you know the transmission coefficient, but I can tell you, imagine I have a black hole that has certain moments, and then what you can try to do is to find the transmission coefficient from the moments. Actually, this is something that an alternative way of computing the transmission coefficient. So first of all, we saw that the inversion of this moment problem existed and the solution is unique. This is a very complex. We just check that this happened. We don't prove mathematically. But I think mathematically it's quite difficult. But okay, we check that for long time of values. This happens, and then what we did is to compute using Pareto Proximas to invert the problem, and we computed solutions for the transmission coefficient just based on these Cavalier integrals, only on Cavalier integrals. And then we compare with, for instance, you see that is a comparison with the WKB, so it works quite well. Okay, I think I'm going to, I want to talk about instabilities, but basically instability, I think I'm going to stop here because it's too much probably. What we just show is that these instabilities that people have found in quasi-normal modes, they appear as well in the Cavalier integrals. So the Cavalier integrals can also be monitoring these instabilities. I think maybe somebody wants to know, just can call to me. So I will stop here. Thank you very much.